record
She's still muted though.
and just do a test. Talk to me.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Okay, great. You can introduce yourself and begin when you're ready, Jacqueline.
Okay. I am Jacqueline Tvrdik, and I am zooming in from Houston, Texas. And my theme is teaching diverse learners. My competency statement is I am competent in using multiple types of instructional modes in order to meet all students' unique needs. My theme, again, was teaching diverse learners. My 3 guiding questions are: how do I classify students into appropriate groups during instruction to achieve success? How do I factor the diversity of students into my instructional methods? And how can I create a lesson involving all levels of instructional techniques to develop high-thinking students? In my presentation overview, my first set of incompetence, I am using my small group intervention lesson plan to show the process of learning through my competency statement. My evidence set 2 of approaching my competency, I am using my after-school program student work to show the practicing of using intentional instructional techniques. And my evidence set 3 of my competence in my competency statement is my student teaching ELA lesson, which is through planning lessons with multiple strategies and modalities in order to meet all my students' needs and their learning styles. So my first evidence of showing incompetency, I actually used my very first practicum experience in creating a small group intervention. And so this, I go ahead and I look down for, if we start my mini lesson, in my lesson, I did plan for learning through cooperative learning groups. However, I decided, I never made accommodations for diverse needs. I had never assessed students in cooperative groups. So I had it in my plan, but I had never actually put my students into groups. I never assessed my students. I never used data to go back and find my students in cooperative groups to actually help them, because they're all learning different. But I never used different manipulatives, dry erase boards for some of my students, and I planned in my lesson plan, as you can see, but I never actually carried it out through my instruction. And at the very end, I included technology for a 21st century classroom, but I never actually used it for extension. And going into my approaching competency, they're different because I actually used differentiating for this one for my first, second, and third grade after school program. And this is one of my students' work. And so as you can see, for starting in my lesson plan, I was using multiple different instructional modes. I started in whole groups. So I did the I do, you do, we do. I started with my whole group, and I modeled a tree map for them for strategies for students that couldn't necessarily grasp the idea of maybe, adding an S, adding an ES, adding an IES. And so as I did it, I modeled for them and added these 3. And as the sticky notes down here, some of my students decided, their choice was, I'm going to pick sticky notes to write down, and they flagged them underneath each column. And so the tree map strategy was for students who needed that model, and they could go back into independent seat work and finish their model. As I was polling for some groups of students where I had already assessed them and I knew where they were, I created sentence stems for them down here. And I had said, the singular now blank is changed to the plural noun. So I gave them a sentence stem modeling again. And for my gifted students, they created their own tree map. And so I gave them, this is, tree map for plural nouns, and they had added their own information into it. So I did plan for differentiation, but, during out the whole lesson, I didn't always encourage it. I used my whole group instruction, and I carried that into independent seat work. And then as I was pulling for small groups, I wasn't encouraging that higher thinking order. I wasn't encouraging them to make those inferences and through, looking at the visuals, or I never had wait time for some of them. I was never adding different instructional modes. I just had my independent work, and then straight back to their seats, and then pulling for those small groups. And for now, for my evidence of competency, this was my 3rd grade student teaching at Leesman Elementary. And so for this, I started my lesson. It was on Lan Popo. It's a folktale, a Chinese folktale. And so I could actually use that for 3 of my ESL students who I had been pulling into small groups to as well, just to go over. They were on a level 4. Now they're on a level 6, but just taking those benchmarks, taking those assessments and understanding, okay, this is where they're struggling. This is when I need to pull them for their small group intervention. So as I was pulling them, then all my other students would go back to their desks, work on independent work, and I'd give them their Venn diagram so they knew the topic was the title, or Lan Popo, and I broke it into 4 sections for them. And for some students, I had given them, this is where you're going to find your vocabulary, and write down your vocabulary if you do not understand some harder words, and scan for unfamiliar words, and write down each section of it. And so I use thinking maps and sentence stems for my tiered instruction. And as whole group instruction was ending, then they went back to work on their independent work, and I was pulling for small group. Then this was about the 3 days of lesson, and then towards the end of the unit, I actually created a Kahoot using technology. So I was creating that blended environment where I want them to experience that higher order thinking, where they can use their iPads in class and they're answering these questions, and they're also giving me feedback of, did you learn something from this? Would you recommend this again? How do you feel of using technology? Do you think that this helped you learn in a different way? And most of my students did say, I did appreciate learning through different modes of instruction. And so these students were able to pick those choices in order to kind of cater to their learning style needs. And so they were also able to make those inferences and asking questions and problem solving. So as I was pulling them into small group, then I was allowing them to experience that same problem solving and get to the point where they can work on it independently. And so that was the end of the unit, and I used the iPads for the Kahoot. And to show my growth of my first stage, I was learning how to group these students by their similar ability, but I was also lacking for stamina in the students to actually work independently. So I was pulling them into their small groups, but they still were not learning how to do it on their own. And by the second stage, I was able to implement those instructional methods during the independent work in order to meet their individual needs in the classroom. And that was through both instructional modes. And by the third stage, I was able to plan and create lessons using all of those multiple teaching strategies to meet all of the individual needs and to enhance that higher order thinking and for them to actually make those real world connections. And this I actually pulled from 2014 from my Teach 331 class, because my quote was, as a teacher, I will aim to perpetuate knowledge and inspire learning for all students with diverse backgrounds. And so I know from day one, I've always wanted to be that teacher that pulls in the small groups, large group discussions, always varying the ability for students to group discussion and changing the arrays of discussion just based on lesson plans and the desire for students just to learn in different temperaments and experiences and using different dialogue and reading material, because not every student does learn in the same way. And so my philosophy of education has only become a reality at this point and it is something I will implement in my very own classroom. And my synthesis, I did create meaningful groups to encourage problem solving and create creative thinking for all my tier students. So understanding which tier that my student falls in, actually assessing them, using that data, and then having those, some kids may have a individualized plan and using that plan in order to group them into their own cooperative learning environment, and encouraging them to think outside of the box for moving into their independent work. And I use various strategies to correspond to the diversity of students and their unique learning needs. So through my last lesson 2 in student teaching, I had 3 students with emotional disturbances and a student with autism. And so I did have to implement and address it in a different learning environment. So I was using tiered lessons, learning centers, graphic organizers. The thinking maps was actually something from our district here. And maintaining, high standards for all culturally and linguistically diverse students. And another one was to teach in the 21st century classroom and promote that higher order thinking with the different levels of techniques to have them in order for them to understand and make those inferences and connect to the other concepts, and using question-answer relationships and elaborating upon it. And what have I learned? The four main things I've learned is small group instruction and that cooperative learning do have a significant impact on student achievement. And I've read through new research to help cater to that 21st century classroom to meet these students' needs, because that is sort of something that will always stick with them. It's ever changing. And encourage students to use alternative methods to solve problems and ask questions. And planning for a differentiation requires way more than one mode of instruction in order to have all those students fully engaged. And what is next? In my future career, I will help students understand learning styles to have that higher order thinking and use those different strategies and learn from multiple different strategies, understanding that if they don't get it the first time, that's okay. We can try another strategy, and using instructional modes to cater their diverse needs. So understanding their own learning style. And I will continue to research new and improved 21st century educational modes so I can build that interest in class and help them to stay engaged. And I will continue to learn through both my students and my colleagues about how do I keep them observing, analyzing, using all of those, reflecting through their own practices too as they're learning through lectures and whole group, small group, independent practice, simulations, and multimedia, multiple different modes to make sure that they are still thinking and still learning and still questioning. And to further my own professional development long term, I will receive small group and cooperative learning training, as well as use reflective practices using progress binders and showing, this is what I had tried this time. It maybe necessarily didn't really work, and then trying this from then on. And in conclusion, my incompetency at the beginning, it was unable to kind of make those different modes come into reality. I was just putting them in my plans. And then moving on to approaching at my halfway point throughout lip block and math block, I actually could adapt a lesson for first, second, third, and individualized plans by using those learning strategies to accommodate the student diversity. And then now being competent in it, I do understand that not all students learn in the same way through the same instruction. So those modes of instruction will keep them engaged through that 21st century classroom. So by using different modes of instruction, students will be more engaged. And there is a mode of instruction for every diverse learner in your classroom. So thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?
Oh, we weren't muted, so we're on. Do you have any questions? Jacqueline, that was terrific. Your use of professional and academic language was really, really strong. There are a lot of use of terms there that they're big girl words, so to speak. But you definitely use them correctly and show that you have a strong knowledge of that. So thank you.
The organization of your presentation also was very easy to follow, very informative. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we'll write down a couple of notes, and Courtney, you're on deck. Thank you.